Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on managing VPPA volatility performance tracking pre-COD. My name is Amber Artrip. I am the head of marketing here at Verse and want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us. I'm just going to lead with a few housekeeping items before we get into today's presentation. First of all, this is being recorded and we will be sending a link to all of the registrants to be able to watch the recording at your leisure within 24 hours of the webinar. The webinar will also be on our website, verse.inc, that you can watch anytime at your leisure. We are also taking questions at the end of today's session, so please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to my colleague, Sam Cotterall, who is our Director of Client Enablement here at Verse, and he's going to be leading us through today's session. Take it away, Sam.
Thanks, Amber. Looking forward to it, and thanks for hosting. Excited to talk about a portion of the whole VPPA pathway that isn't really the focus for many professionals in the space, and that's that time between the signing of the PPA and the commercial operation date, or COD, when the electrons are flowing and you start settling. So with that, I'll introduce the agenda. We're going to start by acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is the rules of the game have changed. Believe it or not, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed this month. It feels like an eternity ago, but we are, as a market, as an industry, still understanding this new energy market reality. So we'll touch on that. It's not the focus of today's webinar, but certainly context and table stakes for having the discussion, which is learning about how to play by these new rules, mostly through the context of you've made a commitment, you've signed a PPA. It's either coming online, just came online, will be coming online. What can we do to play by the new rules of the new game and make the most of your existing commitments? We will transition from that more theoretical topic into a demo of how the Verse platform can help support you in understanding this market volatility and being proactive and really shifting from a reactive mindset to a proactive mindset. So with that, the rules of the game have changed. So, we again have to acknowledge this. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act has passed. Are moving from what I like to think of as this controlled, rules-based environment where we had a nice long timeline of visibility into how we were to go about procuring the different incentives that were in place, relatively new incentives. And I like to think of that as the chess. So this is the old rules. We have this controlled environment, relatively slow moving. I know it feels fast paced, but compared to where we're going, I'm not so sure anymore. And a rules-based environment where the new game is a little bit more chaotic or reactive, more similar to dodgeball. As you can see, Vince Vaughn and Ben Stiller over there. This is a bit of an unpredictable environment that we find ourselves in now. And per the title of this webinar, we've made commitments under the old rules, and the game has changed while we're playing it. So we're going to talk about some of the potential market volatility as a result of these changes, how the economics of a PPA may change. We'll talk about something that I'm sure you're all quite familiar with is this growing demand environment that we haven't really seen in quite some time, but is a new reality, and how all of this is going to impact your understanding of the potential outcomes of a PPA where the ink is dry, but the electrons are not yet flowing. So, when you're going through the approval case, there are modeling that bring in the assumptions of higher demand. There are scenarios you can run that can anticipate or think about different potential policy changes. And of course, there are some unknowns like geopolitical uncertainty. Having the tools to understand, model, and remodel is really important. So we'll get into how Verse can help you with that. And then, of course, revisiting assumptions. When we put this case together, when we made the pitch to our leadership, to finance, to the board potentially, what were the assumptions we made? How have they changed? And what might that mean for our budget? So this isn't going to be news to anyone who's interested in attending this webinar. We're in a time of demand growth, and this is really the first period in almost 2 decades where we've seen in the developed world demand growth. A lot of this, as you can see from the charts here, are really attributed to the growth of AI, to the use of data centers. But it is important to acknowledge that industrial decarbonization through electrification is playing, a major role in this as well. So while demand is rising fast, efficiency gains are, decreasing, and power prices are increasing. So what does that mean for our PPA performance? We'll touch on that. AI hyperscale growth, increasing power demand, again, that decrease in efficiency gains, it is going to dynamically reshape not just the price curves that you're dealing with in future markets, future procurement, but also how your long-term commitment via virtual power purchase agreement will play out. This is also going to, of course, as the demand is increasing, change the availability of best in market or favorable financial outcome PPAs that are available in new procurement environments. So hand in hand with demand growth, the Inflation Reduction Act gave a lot of incentives to build new power, new transmission, distribution, the infrastructure needed to meet this growing demand in our power markets, domestically. So despite that demand growth, we are very likely going to see a slowdown in new capacity additions, especially those from clean, low, no carbon sources. So this supply and demand imbalance is only going to increase, which of course is going to have an element of unpredictability to power prices, likely upward pressure. So new supply was already going to struggle to keep up with this new demand, and the changing dynamics in Washington, further exacerbate the ability to keep pace with that demand. But even without policy support, without new interconnection, with financing delays that could potentially hinder build out, there are a number of items in volatility that can impact your PPA. So we do have, of course, the big one big beautiful bill act that everybody's talking about. There are other things happening in administration that could pose some additional problems for future build out. I think specifically of the executive order issued towards the Department of Interior, requiring secretary level approval for any infrastructure on federal land. This is especially going to have an impact west of the Mississippi, where almost 50% of land, to all land, is owned by the federal government. So not just the tax-based incentive structures that are changing or phasing out, but also some of the permitting approvals and the timing of those are going to impact this build out. So, clean capacity, in our estimation, is going to lag behind load growth. So what is happening with, so we're working with a number of clients in the space and have had a lot of conversations, as you might imagine, on this new reality that we're working in. So when it comes to big tech, when it comes to hyperscalers, supply of electrons is a business imperative. So despite the increasing prices, this is a necessary input. And a lot are saying we hope to operate in a business as usual environment. That said, global organizations do have the option to potentially refocus or reallocate different bandwidth to potentially focus on other markets. So Canada, the European Union, different markets where the procurement may be more cost effective or smoother. And in talking to energy managers, we have heard some potentially shifting strategy to think about other levers. So, we were really thinking about a all systems go on the VPPA path. We might start looking at site level initiatives like battery energy storage systems, efficiency, cogen. What hasn't changed are commitments that are already made. So, as we all know, virtual power purchase agreements are 12 to 15-year agreements typically. And the financial settlements are still going to happen. So, what we're going to do today is really talk about how your team can be ready pre-COD, the moves that you can make to switch your thinking from a contract tenure NPV mindset to a monthly cash flow mindset, helping to better understand how some of these changes may impact that month to month, year to year cash flow situation. And that's where we're going to introduce the what I like to think of as the blind spot problem. So essentially, what we're going to talk about today is avoiding a first invoice, first year surprise trap that a number of organizations, especially first time VPPA signers, tend to fall into, and not by any fault of their own. It has been the status quo where you work really hard through this internal education, through external RFPs, through negotiation to get to a really important milestone of signing that PPA. And you get to sit back, take a deep breath, bask in a little glory of some public recognition for your efforts. And all of this is still well before the project is built, financed, built, and delivering electricity. And it's typical that a fast turnaround from PPA signing to commercial operation might be a year. A lot of the times it's in that 1 to 2 year time period, and sometimes it even is longer than 2 years, an extended period of time. So these long-term contracts don't guarantee a smooth early performance, and in that time period where the developer, your counterparty, is going to talk about tax equity financing, to get debt financing. There are a lot of things that are changing in the market. So that time between signing and COD can vary, but the market isn't going to pause and wait for the project to come online. So it's our experience that in a traditional kind of status quo consultant supported world, there's kind of a period where that you're not connected. You're not talking about the project. Maybe you're focusing on new initiatives, but the tendency is to show back up and offer support once the contract is online and settlements start flowing. It's our contention that that is too late. You're not going to be able to adjust your budget. You're not going to be ready to think about setting up a system for accruals and understanding, before you get the invoice, what you might expect from that invoice. And you haven't had the opportunity to refresh expectations internally, again, as markets change, as budget requests are required. So, building a feedback loop pre-COD prevents that downstream disruption within your organization, and frankly, just you don't want to get caught holding the bag, and being reactive to explain how things changed. Rather, we're here to talk about what we can do to prevent that and avoid the surprises. So one thing that is very common, especially in an environment where long lead time items are hard to procure, where things may or may not get through customs at the border, depending on where you're sourcing your equipment. COD can change. So what we wanted to do is think about the effects in those first few months of a contract being live, of you settling. where the COD has changed. So this is a real world example and shows how a relatively minor shift in the commercial operation date within the same year can have major cash flow implications. So in this case, what happened was we shifted from a potential May commercial operation date or a target commercial operation date in the contract of May to a slight delay, still within the guaranteed or outside COD in the contract. So, in this case, the client had no liquidated damages due to them as a result of the COD. And frankly, that's pretty common in today's PPA negotiating environment where some of, again, the equipment procurement, the approvals, the interconnection aren't as well known from a timeline perspective as they used to be. And this COD pushed back to October. So what does that mean? It means that this client missed the high-priced summer months entirely. As you can see, this seasonality impacted revenue in those first 6 months, which impacted the perception of the finance and leadership teams of how well equipped the sustainability team was to be ready for some of the dynamic environment that we're seeing in today's market. So the COD timing affects your settlement curve, and it is, as you can see here, well over $1 million in impact in that first 6 months. So forecasting must adjust for the time of year effect on cash flow. And that's something that you can absolutely do pre-COD as you're getting information from your counterparty, as you're thinking about, what milestones in the development are hit and when, and what that means for the project actually coming online. Another area that I want to touch on is the build out of renewables. So in past webinars, if you're an aficionado of the Verse webinars, you've heard us talk about California as a leading indicator or that canary in a coal mine for other high renewable penetration markets, and how ERCOT is following closely in its footsteps. So we wanted to switch it up this time, and a lot of organizations that we're talking to are also thinking about, okay, we have our US PPAs or potentially hitting pause on US procurement. We're looking at Europe. What should we be thinking about? Well, here's an example of Spain. So Spain has seen a massive solar build out over the past 10 years. And what that means is that costs are falling, policies could change, but we're seeing that that max total demand in Spain is around 40 gigawatts. And with the really recent build out of solar in the Spanish market, up to 80% of that total demand can be met by solar. And that's going to impact your intraday pricing and really depress hours where a lot of solar is generated when the sun's out. So what we're looking at here is that 24-hour average price year over year from 2020 to 2025. Of course, caveat 2020, we all know what happened with the global pandemic, shaking things up and changing demand profiles. But even if you omit 2020, what you can really see is that average price being depressed year over year over year as more and more solar is built out. So PPA holders are seeing lower than expected values in key hours when their resource is generating. So what this means is you really need to take an hour specific approach to forecasting, not just thinking about that annual average. And if you are sitting on a PPA that is ready to be signed, not yet online, thinking about making sure that your scenarios in your fundamental forecasting approach are taking into account the continued build out of solar in Spain. And what does that mean for me at the end of the day is the real question we're asking here. So, this is looking at a 100 megawatt asset in Spain. This would be a historical performance of that asset. And we modeled it at both a 40 euro and 50 euro strike price. If you have a PPA, you're probably sitting somewhere in between that range, would be our guess on depending on when it was signed and if there are any contractual nuance to be considered. But what you can see is yeah, there are certainly an impact of that intraday pricing of that duck curve. So the project may have looked strong on paper using different forecasting techniques. You may have had a number of scenarios in that forecasting. So when you're thinking of a techno-economic optimization modeling, typically a Plexos approach, these multiple scenarios, it's important to think of which are considering additional build out and what that means for that intraday pricing. So the revenue compression is real. This analysis shows that. It's also often predictable. So that's where this market saturation effect can be realized in that PPA value. What can we do? Well, dummy settlements can help expose that risk before it hits the books. So getting into what verse can do to help you if you are again in that blind spot zone of I have a PPA, it's not yet online. We want to be ready. We need to be ready for settlements when they come. In the words of dodgeball great Patches O'Houlihan, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. So, being prepared for anything is what I'm taking out of that quote for this exercise. So the question isn't whether the risk exists, it's whether or not you're managing it. So I want to explore what a proactive approach can look like pre-COD so that you can stay in control of understanding and present that transparency to all of your internal stakeholders. And to do that, we want to forecast like it's real before it is real. So don't wait for actual invoices to understand what the potential asset's financial impact might be. Use modeling, simulate cash flows. What would this look like if it was online and operating today? So we're shifting from that contract term NPV mindset to a monthly cash flow mindset, and we're doing it before the asset is online. So let's simulate that performance using real data before COD. And that starts with, of course, your forecasted assumptions. What was that approval case? What was that forecasted view of future performance? Now let's take a step back and think about the historical context. So let's simulate this performance of how this asset in that location with your specific commercial terms would have actually performed given historical market conditions. And let's use that information to start training that machine learning model. And that ML model is going to then help us understand using real weather data in that real location at your real settlement point, what the actual performance of that asset would have been had it been in the market. And that gets you ready for day one, where as the first month is happening, before you've had a single invoice from your counterparty, you can start tracking the generation of it. We can pull in the real-time market pricing, and well before you get that invoice, 2 to 3 weeks in most cases, give you a view of what that invoice is going to say. It also gives us the ability to be ready to seamlessly integrate telemetry data. So the model approach is great, and I'll show you in a future slide how close we can get with it. But actual data being piped through API from the asset into our system is better, without a doubt, right? So let's use some of this time pre-COD to set up those systems so that once the electrons are flowing, we can actually track them in real time and give you that insight instantaneously in the platform. Viewed differently, everything on the left here was just what we were talking about. So we're taking the specific asset specs, the equipment performance, your contract terms, overlaying real-time market data, proprietary forecasts, combining that with historical and forecasted weather, mixing it all up in the ARIA platform, and giving you model generation. We're giving you, an idea of generation weighted prices, so you can compare that to assumptions you may have had going in. We're creating those dummy settlements so that you can have that internal communication of what the real-time or real performance market volatility might look like. And of course, updating forecasts on a regular basis so that as the markets move, you can be prepared and think about the impacts of different changes in natural gas pricing, et cetera, on the market prices that you'll receive. So this is again a case study from Verse, where we've compared a traditional approach, which is taking a developer 8760 and a fundamental forecast. Again, a fundamental forecast is designed to look into the long term to give you a project NPV. It is naturally smooth and isn't accounting for any real-time market volatility, typically updated twice a year. And comparing that to a model generation approach. What you can see here is in this representative month, the developer 8760 and fundamental forecast would have predicted about a $240,000 negative net settlement for the client. This was a kind of a weak weather month and it turns out that the model generation predicted about a $1.5 million settlement. The actual settlement came in at 1.7. So moving from that 8760 to a model gen, moving from a fundamental forecast to versus proprietary forecast, we're able to look at and pulling in actual data from the market, from the asset. We're able to move much closer to setting those expectations internally. So accrual accuracy improves dramatically. Dummy invoices allow you to set up finance with and reset expectations. And then what really good looks like is moving to telemetry data and using actual asset performance. So spoiler alert, we can do all this on the platform. So the spoiler is I am going to do a live demo of this later on in the presentation, not too much later, but soon. And this is a screenshot of looking at how we can be proactive and anticipate rather than get a settlement and try to understand what happened and why it deviated from expectations. So using pre-COD insights, again, to align that internal expectation, correct assumptions, prepare stakeholders for volatility, get ahead of having to reactively explain deviations. And what we found is that the communication through stakeholders, through the platform, whether it's exporting data, whether it's taking key numbers and sharing them in Slack or Teams, or having everyone who is involved in the process have access to the platform. That transparency helps with the communication and understanding of asset performance. So moving from kind of those inputs to the pre-COD insights to what are we actually looking for here? Well, it's that financial clarity, right? It's confidence in a forecast and being able to check back and see how forecasts have changed over time. Internal risk literacy is incredibly important. So combining, the asset specs, the weather data, the market signals, and modeling to deliver this so on day one you are ready to understand accruals is how Verse is plugging into this pre-COD environment and helping clients understand before an asset comes online how it will be performing. And we love to think of this as a hybrid model because we're not just going to give you the keys to the car and say go enjoy your drive. No, there's certainly elements of a clean energy program that are better suited for technology. That's going to be software as a service tools handling ongoing analytics, that performance tracking, data management. We of course understand that your business's core competency may not be working in power markets. So we are also providing high touch advisory. We are adding context. We are bringing these industry relationships and blending our advisory expertise with software precision, excuse me, and we're pairing this high touch support with the high frequency insights to give you confidence and clarity. We've talked a lot about the PPA management. Important to note that our full platform supports early stage planning all the way through live operations. So pulling in key market data in a data visualization hub, helping use load and supply information to to create and revise goals and create that procurement roadmap. Having tools to go to market and evaluate bilateral offers and understand what the financial implications might be. And then, of course, what we're talking about mostly today is what we call the portfolio insights. So that's validating, invoices, that's updating forecasts, it's reporting on PPA financial performance. And it's really important to point out that, there are probably different individuals within an organization responsible for different elements of this. And having a single common data platform allows the team to work together rather than in silos and having, work from one team get lost in an Excel spreadsheet and not fully translated to another team. But again, we are focusing on the portfolio insights piece. So invoice validation, making sure that the terms you worked hard to negotiate are met as the asset is performing. Understanding before you get an invoice, what that invoice is going to look like. Updating budgets and expectations for the PPA across the next quarter, the next half, the next year, the next 5 years. And of course, answering those ad hoc questions that inevitably are going to come from different stakeholders within an organization. So, without further ado, why don't we dive in and check it out? I usually have Shazad on these webinars with me where I get to take a little break, so I'm going to just have a sip of water here. But welcome to Aria, the Verse platform. So starting here, just want to start with the setups, understanding how we can add supply and demand assets, understand load as easy as clicking in, adding a VPPA, a rec agreement, other supply resources you might have, financial products like hedges that you may have in place, and of course, load. So, diving in and saying the specifics of your contract, and making sure that all of this is pulling through. This is the backbone of the platform. So understanding that load and supply, and pulling that into and matching that with the market data that we're pulling in. So this is again that backbone of data, really important. Give you a full view of your load, full view of your supply, any sort of financial products or rec agreements that you have in place. This is going to pull into a number of other apps. So from looking at any wholesale market exposure in risk management to creating or revising renewable glide paths. All of these data feed those tools. And of course, again, the focus of today, portfolio insights. So starting in portfolio insights, where we can look at a full suite portfolio of projects. This is a dummy environment, of course. So, the data are going to be not specific to any real projects, but want to just show how this works without ruining any confidentiality agreements. But we have a PGM, MISO, SPP, and ERCOT asset loaded up in here. On the overview page, we can see the whole rolled up performance of the asset. This is a global product, so if you have PPAs in Europe, they would show up under different regions. We can look at how forecasts change by selecting different iterations of that forecast. We are able to name forecasts. So if you're thinking about, creating a budget and want to be able to go back to that forecast and see what it was, even though forecasts are updating as we move forward in time, you are able to name it and say today. It's not going to be a good one to come back to, but I'm going to go with it. Today's forecast. You are able to, of course, look out through the whole term of the contract into the future, focusing on a shorter time period today, as that's the purpose of the exercise, and of course, dive into a specific asset. So, in this case, We're going to zoom in on what we're calling apex meadows. We're looking at a time period of January of 24 through the end of this year. You're going to see a number of different lines here. Uh, Looking in the past, we have what's called a best available estimate. This is a predict the past. So we don't have the actual data from this asset. So what are we doing? We're using that ML model. We're using the real-time weather data. We're using the real-time market pricing or day ahead, depending on how you settle, to say, okay, even without the settlement or the data provided to us from the developer, we can get a very, very good idea of how this asset would generate. And that's really important for, that for the pre-COD case where, putting in the Latin long, pulling in that specific weather data from that site, knowing the specifics of your equipment and how it should have performed, and overlaying the real-time market data gives us an idea of generation, of what the gross revenue or the fixed PPA price times generation might be, how that compares to the market revenue or what the power asset is actually selling electrons into the market at what price. And of course, coming up with what's most important for everyone involved, which is the net spend. This goes into, so you're seeing all of that as we get into the future. And we can, of course, extend this out. Just go from January of 25 to let's go 2027. We can see that this, goes into the forecasted view. As I mentioned, forecasts are going to be updated. So, being able to see those changes is really important. And that's where we get into our compare mode or the time machine, the keep us honest view here. So what I have here is an early iteration. This is from December of 24. And the December of 24 forecast, I named year-end forecasts, hypothetically something that was used for budgeting. We are going to then compare that to the one I just called today. This is a quite a long time period, so maybe we'll drop this back a little bit here and go for just through the end of this year. Um, and what we can see here is how the forecast compared to one another. So, as you're revising forecasts, as you're doing a retro on performance, once you have the real asset up and running, this is a tool that I wish I had when I was in the consulting world to do that retro and look at the deviations in forecasts, have every iteration of the forecast at your fingertips, know which ones were used for what purposes, and then being able to immediately compare that performance. So, relatively minor deviations here, but nonetheless, as things happen in the real market, we're able to compare this to the actual performance of the asset as well and see how performant, not just how forecast compared, but also how performance compared to forecast. Looking at net spend again, but of course we can look at market revenue generation and RECs to get an idea there. So moving into actuals, we did load some dummy invoices into this. So I'm going to jump into a month where we have real data or fake real data. This is important as invoices are generated, versus automatically ingesting those, looking not just for deviations in price or timestamp or those data errors that you really need to be looking at because these reports are put together manually on the developer side and sent to you, and that's creating your invoice for the settlement. But we're also looking at the project generation and we're comparing, potential and expected generation to actual generation and seeing if there are any deviations in performance that might warrant a conversation with your counterparty. A really good example of this is, if you have a solar asset in a snowy environment, there may be a performance guarantee for, X hours or X day, X time after a snowfall, having the panels cleared so they can generate again. Well, by jumping into these data, we are able to, and I have 2 months selected, so let me just select one. we are able to look at potential deviations, not just from data errors. So as you can see here in this invoice on the last 2 days of the month, it looks like the PPA price was misprinted in the calculation, and therefore every interval in those 2 days was wrong. This resulted in a pretty big change in the net spend, and something that our automated invoice validation process would flag for you as a user. So that's the data side. We also are looking at the generation. So we can jump in here and see again what model generation or how should this asset have performed given the actual weather for the last month, and see how that compared to the invoice generation. And if there's a deviation, zooming in on specific times to say, okay, well, potentially something was awry here and we should have a conversation with our counterparty. Looking at the clock, whirlwind tour of Aria. Would love to spend more time with each of you, of course, talking about this and how it might specifically apply to your projects, your portfolio. But I'm going to jump back into the presentation and I think wrap it up and go into Q&A. So thanks for working with me there. Um, in conclusion, there this is a new what we like to think of as the new standard operating procedure. We really want to move from that reactive mindset of I have the data, what happened, to a real-time understanding of markets and being proactive. So, forecasting like your asset is already online. And what's that going to give you? It's going to give you better clarity into budgeting. And that's before COD. So avoid the surprises, avoid the scrambling of explaining why your budget was wrong, by living the volatility before you're living the volatility. So use our software as your co-pilot and make this a part of your energy program's DNA. This should be a standard operating procedure. This is not an exception. It is good practice. So with that, I'm gonna take a deep breath and maybe invite Amber back onto the call and see if any questions have come up while I've been doing all this talking.
Great job, Sam. That was awesome. Thank you so much for that. And we did get a couple questions come in from the audience.
Hope they
So,
were nice to me.
yeah, I think so. I'll let you be the judge of that. So, first question is how early in the project lifecycle do you recommend starting this kind of modeling? Is it only helpful post-close, or can we use it earlier?
Yeah, interesting. I like the proactive thought. That's part of the new standard operating procedure that we are talking about here. Um, that said, I don't know if I would start this before I have a signed contract. And why is that? Well, as I'm thinking about the PPA negotiation journey, there is a sense of urgency, right? So if you issue an RFP, you have a response date, you are moving into potential what we like to think of as like a short list. So the cream of the crop, cream has floated to the top. We're going to look at just a handful of projects. To do this for each of those projects would require, setting up the modeling and seeing over time how they performed. But really, your goal there is to get into exclusivity. So yeah, I think I breezed through it, but we do have the what we call the valuation app, which gives you the view of that financial modeling. So that's going to be moving back to that contract term NPV focus. We can break out annual cash flows in that, so that's probably what I would recommend is looking at some of those annual cash flows and not necessarily fully focused on the discounted value for the whole term of the contract. But I would say that once the commercial terms are ironed out, once there's a commitment to move forward with the project, you've gone and gotten the board or executive approval that you need. That's when I would start modeling cash flows, creating the dummy invoices, and essentially creating what I like to think of as a phantom asset where your asset is being built and where it will be operating in the future. So yeah, good question. Kind of a sweet spot here in that financing and construction timeline. So post PPA signature, pre COD.
Great. Here's another almost related question. Any advice you have to bring sustainability and finance teams together in this process?
Yeah, I think that's what's beautiful about a single platform. We are not a license-based platform. We're going to work with your organization. So, whether it's accounting, whether it's finance, treasury, sustainability, procurement, you know, get everyone the transparency that they need to do their specific elements of operating this asset from an internal business perspective. We have some clients who you have a few people who are kind of holding they have the logins and are disseminating information. Maybe that's a best practice in your organization. We do have other organizations who are like, we want anyone and everyone who needs or should have visibility into this asset to be on the platform. So, that's really up to you. But I would say that having a consult. So there was a slide where I talked about like the different stages of energy procurement. Um, Having each of those individuals, whether they're thinking about, the commitments that you've made through SBTI or RE100 and, the recs that are coming off of this, or, they're much further downstream and they're writing the checks, everyone in that whole spectrum of touching or being involved in the PPA can have the same access to the information, and of course looking at it through their own lens. So I would say it's a really good bridge of these different teams that, once were siloed in spreadsheets and now can have the same data access on a single platform.
I love it. Last question here is there a way to trial this
Hmm.
process?
I love that one. Um, yeah, yeah, let's do it. I mean, sure, you can take my word for it, but I think, the proof's in the pudding. So we would love to think about, a trial basis and, let you see the types of information you have access to and think about how you can use that internally. So absolutely, I think that's a great Great. Maybe last question, Amber, because that feels like a mic drop question. Appreciate whoever threw that up into the chat. Um, yeah, Amber, how do you get in touch with us?
Yeah, so feel free to visit our website, verse.inc. We will also be following up with an email linking uh, the link to the video recording of this webinar and a few other case studies and assets that you can explore. And you can just reply to us on that email thread, and we'll get you connected to the right folks. So thank you to all of our attendees who are on the call today. Thank you for taking the time with us this morning. And thank you, Sam, for putting together a great presentation and demo. And we will see you all at the next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.